The sea was flat, almost perfectly still. No wind across the deck, no visible swell, just a long, uninterrupted stretch of gray water under a pale morning sky. On the bridge, no one was speaking. The USS Abraham Lincoln moved forward at a steady pace. No sudden maneuvers, no urgency, just controlled motion through the Strait of Hormuz, and yet, something didn't feel right. It wasn't visible. It wasn't audible. But something, somewhere below the surface, had changed. The morning had started like any other transit. Routine positioning, standard navigation updates, aircraft secured on deck, radar systems cycling through normal sweeps. Every movement had a rhythm. Crew members followed procedures without hesitation. The carrier group maintained formation. Distances were precise. Communications were minimal. Below deck, sonar operators monitored the water column. Most of what they saw was expected. Merchant vessels, background noise, thermal layers shifting slowly with the rising sun. Nothing unusual. At least not yet. The Strait of Hormuz was never quiet. But it was predictable. Traffic moved in known lanes. Signals followed known patterns, and that predictability was what made it manageable. Control came from familiarity. But then something changed. It wasn't an alarm. It wasn't even a warning. Just a faint return on sonar. Weak, intermittent, almost indistinguishable from background noise. The operator didn't react immediately, just watched it. Waited. Adjusted gain slightly. The signal faded, then returned. Same bearing, different depth, still weak, still uncertain. He marked it, logged it, and moved on. Because in this environment, small anomalies happened all the time. Most of them meant nothing. But then it came back, stronger this time. More defined, still distant. But now, consistent. The operator leaned closer to the screen, adjusted filters again, and that's when it became clear. It wasn't random, it was controlled. A contact, subsurface, moving slowly, parallel to the carrier's path. He reported it, calmly. No urgency, just a single line of information passed up the chain. One contact, unconfirmed, low confidence. At first, it didn't change anything. The carrier continued its course. No deviation, no alert status change, because one contact wasn't a threat, not yet. But then a second signal appeared, different bearing, slightly closer, also moving, also controlled. Now the pattern was harder to ignore. Two contacts, both subsurface, both maintaining distance, both tracking. The tone in the sonar room didn't change, but the silence did. Operators stopped casual conversation. Focus narrowed. Data points were no longer routine. They were being compared, cross-referenced, timed, and that's when the third contact appeared. Closer, deeper, slower, not parallel, intercepting. No one said it out loud, but the shape was forming. This wasn't random movement. This was positioning. Above deck, nothing had changed. The sea still looked calm. The carrier still moved forward. But below the surface, something was organizing, and that's when things became dangerous. 3 contacts became 4, then 5, each one occupying a different sector, different depth, different speed, but all converging toward a common geometry. It wasn't tight, it wasn't aggressive, it was spaced, deliberate, like pieces on a board. The analysis team began mapping vectors, plotting trajectories, and the picture became clearer with each update. They weren't just tracking the carrier, they were surrounding it, at distance, at angles, maintaining separation, but closing slowly. Too slowly to trigger immediate alarm, too precisely to ignore, and that's when the realization set in. This wasn't accidental. It was coordinated, 5 submarines, operating together, inside one of the most monitored waterways in the world. The question wasn't just what they were doing, it was why. Because submarines don't operate like this without purpose. Every movement costs energy. Every position reveals risk, and yet they were holding formation, maintaining spacing, closing in, and that's when the tone shifted. Not to panic, not to urgency, but to calculation. Because now it wasn't about detection. It was about intent, and intent changes everything. The carrier didn't change speed, didn't alter course, but systems began to shift. Quietly, almost invisibly. Sonar sensitivity increased. Radar sweeps adjusted. Air assets were prepared. No announcements, no alarms, just a gradual tightening of awareness. Because what happened next would depend on timing, and timing was narrowing. The submarines continued to close, distance decreasing, angles tightening, still outside engagement range, but no longer distant. Each contact now confirmed, classified, Iranian origin, operating with discipline, no erratic movement, no mistakes, and that's what made it more serious, because this wasn't a provocation. It was a demonstration, or something more. And that's when the first active signal appeared. Brief, sharp, directed, a sonar ping. Not from the carrier, from below. One of the submarines had gone active, just for a moment, then silence again. But that moment was enough. Because active sonar isn't passive. It's a statement. It reveals position. But it also sends a message. I see you. And now the situation had changed. The carrier was no longer just being tracked. It was being engaged. Not with weapons, but with awareness. And awareness in this environment is the first step. The distances continued to shrink. 5 contacts now within coordinated range, not clustered, but positioned, each covering a sector, each capable of closing faster if needed. And that's when the internal countdown began. Not spoken, not displayed, but understood. Because at this range, options narrow, response windows shorten, and mistakes become permanent. The carrier group began its response. Quiet, layered, controlled. Helicopters lifted off first. No rush, no visible urgency. Just a smooth transition from deck to air. They moved outward, low altitude, sensors active, listening, scanning. Above them, the sky remained empty, but below, the water was no longer quiet. Sonar systems intensified, multiple arrays now focused on tracking, triangulating, confirming positions in real time. Every movement of the submarines was now being watched, measured, predicted, and that's when something unexpected happened. One of the submarines changed speed, slight increase, subtle, but deliberate. It wasn't maintaining formation anymore. It was adjusting, closing faster, on a vector that intersected more directly, and that shift changed everything because now intent was no longer ambiguous. It was directional. The response tightened, helicopters repositioned, dropping sonar buoys in a widening pattern, creating a net. Each buoy transmitting data back instantly, building a live map of the subsurface environment. And in that map, the formation became undeniable. 5 submarines, encircling, closing, not aggressively, but steadily. And that's when the countermeasures began. Again, no sudden movements, no visible escalation. But beneath the surface, the carrier group was reshaping the environment. Acoustic signals were introduced, decoys deployed, subtle distortions in the water column. Designed not to attack, but to confuse, to complicate, to disrupt the clarity of targeting solutions. Because submarines rely on precision, and precision can be degraded, slowly, carefully, without confrontation. But then something changed again, a second active ping. Longer this time, more focused, from a different submarine, followed by a third, not simultaneous, but sequential. They were communicating, not verbally, but acoustically, coordinating, and that meant the window was closing. The carrier group adjusted again. Destroyers shifted position, slightly, barely noticeable from above, but enough to alter the geometry, enough to create layers, because now it wasn't just about defense, it was about control, and control requires structure. The helicopters tightened their pattern, now directly above projected submarine positions, tracking them continuously, limiting their freedom to maneuver unnoticed. And that's when the closest submarine made its move. It didn't accelerate. It didn't dive. It simply adjusted depth, rising slightly, changing its acoustic profile. And for a moment, it became clearer on sonar, too clear, because that level of visibility isn't accidental, it's deliberate. A signal, and that signal was understood. The carrier group responded immediately, not with force, but with presence. A helicopter moved directly overhead, holding position, maintaining constant tracking, making it clear. You are seen. The submarine held its course for a few seconds, then slowed, then adjusted again, and that's when the formation began to break. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. One submarine reduced speed, another altered bearing. The outermost contact began drifting away from the perimeter. The geometry loosened. The encirclement dissolved, and that shift was subtle, but decisive. Because once coordination breaks, control follows. The carrier group maintained pressure, not escalating, not pursuing aggressively, just holding the environment, maintaining visibility, sustaining presence. And one by one, the submarines disengaged. Distances increased, angles widened, signals weakened until they became what they were at the beginning: faint, distant, uncertain, but now understood. The sea returned to its earlier state: calm, flat, quiet. Above deck, operations resumed their normal rhythm. No announcements, no visible reaction, just a continuation of movement through the strait, as if nothing had happened. But everything had, because 5 submarines had approached, coordinated, tested, and then withdrawn. Not defeated, but denied. And that distinction matters. Because in this environment, dominance isn't loud, it isn't explosive, it doesn't announce itself. It's measured, controlled, maintained. Below the surface, the water held no trace of what had occurred. No debris, no disturbance, just depth, silence, and memory. The carrier continued forward, steady, unchanged. But the situation had shifted, not visibly. Not dramatically, but permanently, because now both sides knew what could happen, how close it could get, and how quickly control could change. Nothing exploded, no weapons were fired, no alarms echoed across the deck, but the balance had been tested, and quietly, it had held. The transit continued without interruption, course unchanged, speed constant. From a distance, nothing distinguished this passage from any other movement through the strait. The carrier cut through the water with the same controlled momentum. The escort ships maintained their spacing. Aircraft remained secured. But below the surface, attention had not relaxed. Sonar operators continued to scan, not for what was there, but for what might return, because contacts like that don't simply disappear. They reposition, they observe, and sometimes they wait. Data from the earlier encounter was still being processed. Every movement of the 5 submarines had been recorded. Angles, speeds, depth changes, not just where they were, but how they behaved. Patterns were extracted, compared against previous encounters, looking for consistency, looking for deviation, because behavior reveals intent, and intent predicts future action. But then something subtle appeared again. Not a full contact, not a confirmed track. Just a disturbance, low frequency, intermittent, at the edge of detection, different from before, weaker, but familiar. The operator didn't report it immediately. He watched, let it develop, adjusted filters, waited for confirmation, because false signals waste time. And time, in this environment, matters. The signal faded, then returned. Same bearing. Deeper this time. Slower. And that's when he marked it. Not as a threat, not as a contact, just interest. But that was enough. Because after what had already happened, nothing was ignored. Above, a helicopter adjusted its orbit, slightly lower. Sensors recalibrated, listening again. The water was still, but not empty. And that's when a second disturbance appeared. Further out, even weaker, but aligned. Not random, not environmental, correlated. The system flagged it, not automatically, but through recognition, human recognition, because machines detect signals, but people recognize patterns, and this felt familiar. Not identical, but close enough. The possibility formed quietly. They hadn't fully left. They had repositioned, at greater distance, lower profile, less visible, but still present, watching. And that changed the posture again, not to escalation, but to awareness. The carrier group didn't react visibly. No course change, no speed adjustment. But internally, the focus narrowed.